Welcome to the 2024 Hagel Lecture at the University of Chicago. A thank you to all who are here tonight and to all those joining live stream from the U.S. military, including our troops in Europe and around the world. I am Paul Post, Associate Professor of International Politics at the University of Chicago. The Chicago Project on Security and Threats is a nonpartisan research center at the University of Chicago dedicated to advancing scholarship on international politics, security, and economic relations that advances peace and prosperity. It does so by focusing on research questions that pertain to security, broadly defined, about which scholars, as yet, know relatively little. Most importantly, the knowledge gained from studying the topic has the potential to impact policy decisions that enhance security to the United States, nations, and peoples around the world. CPOST seeks to give voice to the heart of the country on important issues of national security, and tonight's event is an important example. CPOST is proud to sponsor tonight's Hagel Lecture on Civil Politics and International Security. The Hagel Lecture Series was established in 2019 in collaboration with Secretary Chuck Hagel, CPOST, and the University of Chicago to promote open and informed debate on current foreign policy and national security challenges facing the United States and their implications for the country as a whole. At this moment, we cannot think of a better pair of individuals to participate in this year's lecture. Specifically, we are pleased to have in conversation former Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel and former U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security Jeh Johnson. Both served under President Barack Obama, and both have been highly invested in understanding threats to democracy within the United States and in the world. In a moment, Dean Woodward will more fully introduce both Secretary Hagel and Secretary Johnson. On behalf of CPOST, I would like to thank the individuals who contributed to making the 2024 Hagel Lecture possible. Bill Obenschein, Fawad El-Nagar, Christopher Hasbrook, John de Blasio, Aaron Dowd, Ann Wedner, Michael Kennedy, George Little, and Carol Montag. So that you know the order of tonight's event, Dean Woodward will first provide a welcome and speaker introduction. Secretary Johnson will then give the keynote address, followed by a conversation between Secretaries Hagel and Johnson, moderated by CPOST founding director, Professor Robert Pape. We will then turn to a Q&A with the audience. At this time, I would like to introduce Amanda Woodward, Dean of the Social Science Division at the University of Chicago and the William S. Gray Distinguished Service Professor of Psychology. Dean Woodward has been a leading supporter of CPOST and the Hagel Lecture, and it is with great pleasure that I introduce her now.
Thank you. Good evening. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for the introduction. On behalf of those attending in person and those joining us remotely, I extend my thanks to you, Paul, and to your CPOST colleagues, including Bob Pape, for convening an important discussion. This is such an important event here at the University of Chicago, and I know its importance extends well beyond this place, but from my position as dean, I'm so delighted to have this convening every year. Let me start by saying a couple of words about Bob Pape. He's a professor in the Department of Political Science and faculty director of CPOST. He works at the interface of national policy and basic research, including the study of political violence, public endorsement of violence, and social prejudice. Over the past several years, Bob's worked extensively to understand violent dangers to our democracy in the wake of January 6th, while continuing his work on international security strategy related to the Middle East, elsewhere around the world. And I just have to mention his recent work helping us understand how college students are thinking about the state of the world and how important those insights are for us. So the purpose of the Hagel Lecture is to illuminate key questions and challenges and potential solutions from internationally renowned voices that encompass the social sciences. And many of today's attendees are generous supporters of CPOST, and Paul just thanked a number. And I just want to say again how important your contributions are to fueling this cutting-edge research and this programming for more than a decade. We are grateful for your partnership and for creating opportunities like this evening's program. So now it's my great honor to introduce our two speakers. And I welcome Secretary Johnson and Secretary Hagel. Thank you both for joining us on campus today to share your insights and perspectives. As many of you know, Secretary Hagel served as the 24th Secretary of Defense from February of 2013 until February of 2015. He is the only Vietnam veteran and the first enlisted combat veteran to serve as Secretary of Defense. During his tenure, he directed significant steps to modernize America's partnerships and alliances, advance the rebalance of the Asia-Pacific, to bolster European allies, to enhance defense cooperation in the Middle East, while overseeing the end of America's combat mission in Afghanistan. In addition, he led major initiatives for service members and their families, including increasing resources for suicide prevention, combating sexual assault, and accounting for missing personnel. Prior to his time as Secretary of Defense, he served 2 terms in the U.S. Senate, representing the state of Nebraska. Before joining the Senate, among his leadership roles, he was a distinguished professor at Georgetown University, president of McCarthy & Company, and served as deputy administrator of the Veterans Administration under President Reagan. He's the author of the book, America, Our Next Chapter, and was the subject of a 2006 book by Charlene Behrens entitled Chuck Hagel, Moving Forward. He's a graduate of the University of Nebraska at Omaha. Now, Secretary Johnson. Secretary Johnson served as Secretary of Homeland Security from 2013 to 2017, as General Counsel of the Department of Defense from 2009 to 2012, and as General Counsel of the Department of the Air Force from 1998 to 2001, and as Assistant United States Attorney of the Southern District of New York before that. In private practice at Paul Weiss, Secretary Johnson is an experienced litigator and trial lawyer and a fellow in the American College of Trial Lawyers. He co-chairs the firm's cybersecurity and data protection practice and advises high-tech companies, private equity firms, and government contractors on the legal aspects of cybersecurity, national security, data privacy, government relations, crisis management, high-stakes litigation, and regulatory matters. All the kinds of things I'm thinking as a dean, we need this here at the university. He's currently a member of the board of directors of Lockheed Martin, U.S. Steel and MetLife, and is a trustee of Columbia University. He is co-chairing the ABA-sponsored National Task Force with former Judge J. Michael Luttig to assess ways to restore public trust in American democracy. Earlier this year, Secretary Johnson received the New York State Bar Association's Gold Medal Award, its highest honor as a leader in diversity, equity, and inclusion. Secretary Johnson holds a bachelor's from Morehouse College. I was just with the prior president of Morehouse College, Walter Massey, earlier today. You'd be happy to know. And a JD from Columbia Law School. So I'm a dean, and I think about the alumni of our division, and I have to note there's a very special connection today to an alumnus of our division. It turns out that Secretary Johnson's grandfather, Charles Johnson, completed a graduate degree in sociology at the University of Chicago in 1917. While a graduate student, Charles Johnson assumed responsibility as Director of Research and Investigation for the Chicago Urban League. During the First World War, he enlisted in the Army and served in France, and he returned to Chicago after the war, just a week before the race riot in Chicago of 1919. He completed a study and analysis of the race riot and planned a study of its causes. The governor of Illinois accepted his plan and appointed Johnson as Associate Executive Secretary of Chicago's Commission on Race Relations. Charles Johnson, among his many accomplishments, later served as the president of Fisk University. It's delightful to have that connection, and it's delightful to have you with us, Secretary Johnson. I welcome you now to the podium.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you. It is nice to be back in Chicago. Chicago is the reason I'm a New York Mets fan and have been for 54 years. It was the summer of 1969, and I had a cousin who lived here on the south side of Chicago. His mother was pregnant, and she wanted him out of the house for the summer. She gave birth to her daughter Francine, who I think is somewhere in this audience. There she is, right there. She was born the day the men landed on the moon, July 1969. But anyway, her older brother Richard, he had to get out of the house for the summer, so he came to live with us in New York. And her older brother Richard was an avid Cubs fan. He slept with his Chicago Cubs hat on. All summer long, I had to listen to about the $1 million infield, Banks, Beckert, Kissinger, Santo, Huntley, Ferguson, Jenkins on the mound. And it was the first season of division play. And the Cubs were in first place for most of the season, and then the Mets overtook them. And of course, went on to win the pennant, win the World Series against the Baltimore Orioles. And the next summer, when I returned to Chicago in 1970, my cousin Richard was a White Sox fan. Mr. Secretary, I'm pleased and honored to have the opportunity to deliver a lecture as part of a series in your name. You are like my law partner and mentor, Ted Sorensen, a native of Nebraska. I will repeat here what I once heard Ted say at the outset of his speech. Ladies and gentlemen, I am about to exercise my free speech rights, and that's what you are getting, a free speech. I also have a disclosure to make, which I have never made before, but I suspect I will make many more times in the future. AI wrote no part of this speech. Blame me, I wrote it all myself. There is little more one can ask of a public servant than that which Chuck Hagel has delivered. Service and sacrifice in uniform during war and combat, 2 terms as a United States Senator, and service as our nation's 24th Secretary of Defense. While in the Senate, you proved to be an independent and critical thinker and demonstrated the courage to question the Iraq War you once supported. You always put the best interests of your country above your party. I regret that there are few, if any, Chuck Hagels serving in Washington today. I'm also pleased, as the Dean mentioned, to be here on the campus of the University of Chicago, where over 100 years ago, my grandfather, Charles Johnson, studied and got his start as a sociologist. With the support of Julius Rosenwald and others at age 26, Dr. Johnson was the Associate Executive Secretary of the commission that studied the 1919 Chicago race riot. The 800-page commission report is notable because it is not merely an account of the riot itself and its immediate causes. It is an in-depth study of black migration to Chicago from the South, the black population of Chicago, and the housing problems that faced this city. The report states, quote, "Our race problem must be solved in harmony with the fundamental law of the nation and with its free institutions. The problem must not be regarded as sectional or political, and it should be studied and discussed seriously, frankly, and with an open mind." Fast forward a century later to the important work of another social scientist here at the University of Chicago, Robert Pape. Like Dr. Johnson's work, Professor Pape's research is a serious study of a difficult and historic moment. It is at the heart of what I want to talk to you about today. It's an election year. and I'm a Democrat. But today I speak to you not as a partisan Democrat, but as a partisan American. The title of this event is Dangers to Democracy at Home and Abroad. Last year, Freedom House reported that on a global basis, freedom has been on the decline for 17 straight years worldwide. Yet today, we must convene a forum in Chicago that includes a discussion of the dangers of democracy at home. For all my life, we in America boasted that despite what happens someplace else, we are the most enduring democracy in the world, and that our transfers of presidential power are always orderly and peaceful. After January 6, 2021, we can no longer say that. Professor Pape's research reveals that January 6th is not just a stain on American history, it is a harbinger of things that could come. January 6th was a pot of scalding water that boiled over onto the U.S. Capitol. The physical damage done that day has been repaired, and those responsible are being brought to justice. But the pot of scalding water remains. The burner underneath is still turned to high, and the pot is ready to boil over again on a moment's notice. Professor Pape's research tells us those arrested for January 6th were motivated by fear of the so-called Great Replacement, that a surprising number are educated, small business owners, and that a majority come not from red counties and red states, but from blue counties in the country that Joe Biden won. Most alarming, Professor Pape estimates that somewhere between 12 and 18 million Americans agree that, quote, use of force is justified to restore Donald Trump to the presidency, end quote, and that large segments of his political base believe one, some, or all of the following: that the 2020 election was rigged, that the 2024 election could be rigged, that the prosecution against Trump are politically motivated, and that the federal government is a deep state of immoral people. Similar research reveals that 51% of Americans say they are dissatisfied with how our democracy works, and 46% say they are open to other forms of government. Less than a third of so-called millennials say it is essential to live in a democracy. We must never take for granted the virtue of living in a democracy. Democracy is like water. You don't appreciate its critical importance until you are thirsty or your land is scorched by wildfire. Democracy is like oxygen. You don't wake up every day thanking God for the air we breathe, but if someone tried to take it away, you would be desperate to keep it. Democracy is freedom, and the most basic human instinct is to seek freedom. 16 years ago this November, my family and I were in this city to witness something I never expected to see in my lifetime. By the largest popular vote in U.S. history, we elected a black man named Barack Hussein Obama, who also happens to be a former faculty member of this university, to become our president. I recall the hundreds of TV cameras positioned on bleachers in Grant Park. The whole world was watching because the whole world knew what was happening that night in America was special and historic. I recall the emails I received from colleagues and friends the next day. I'm crying. Thank you for leading me to this man, or bravo, I am now prepared and proud to become a United States citizen. Even John McCain, Obama's opponent, was magnanimous in his concession speech that he recognized that history was being made that night. I will never forget the front page of the next morning's Chicago Sun-Times, a full-page photo of Barack Obama and the simple two-word caption, Mr. President. Then somehow came Barack Obama's immediate successor, a man with autocratic, self-serving impulses, no experience in public office, no respect for the Constitution and constitutional norms, who inspired and incited the January 6th insurrection, was impeached twice, has been found civilly liable for sexual assault and bank fraud and is indicted as a criminal defendant in 4 separate jurisdictions, and yet today is one of 2 viable candidates to get elected president again. How did this happen? Many foreign observers of the arc of American history must be puzzled at this stark turn of events. I believe what Franklin Roosevelt said in his final inaugural address in 1945, quote, "Sometimes we will be rising to the heights, and then all will seem to reverse itself and start downward. The great fact to remember is that the trend of civilization itself is forever upward, that a line drawn through the middle of the peaks and the valleys of centuries always has an upward trend." FDR's words are by no means inevitable, however. We must work hard to push the boulder upward on that straight path among the peaks and valleys. We must face the alarming results of Professor Pape's research head on, that millions of Americans believe our country is headed in the wrong direction. They have become disillusioned with their government and their leaders, susceptible to the darkest conspiracy theories, and that Donald Trump, no matter what he says and does, speaks for them. At this juncture in American history, the future of our democracy depends on what we do now to combat growing levels of American anger, apathy, ignorance, and indifference. About a year ago, the American Bar Association asked me to co-chair with former Judge Michael Luttig a task force to secure our democracy. The task force is an extraordinary bipartisan group of distinguished Americans that consist of not just lawyers, but historians, scholars, former judges, and 2 former presidential candidates. We're traveling the country on a listening tour to places like Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Arizona. The response to our efforts has been incredible. As we encounter many others concerned about the future of our democracy who want to join forces with us, we're focused on bolstering civics in education, the creation of rapid response teams to address urgent legal issues around the election, and promoting election worker safety. We'll issue a report and recommendations to the ABA convention in August of this year. For myself, I am convinced that to safeguard our democracy, we must focus our efforts on the enablers. In any movement, backward or forward, there are a group of core protagonists and a larger, more passive population of enablers. No effort to take this country backward can succeed without enablers, those who know better but are prepared to excuse narcissism for the sake of lower taxes, lower interest rates, or just plain apathy, cowardice, or political expediency. I believe we must re-incentivize political behavior among the enablers. We must reform the whole manner in which we elect members of Congress. We have a system now in which almost all seats in Congress have been politically gerrymandered to protect incumbents on both sides of the aisle. The process of legislative redistricting is rigged, literally, to the point where the politicians pick their voters, not the other way around. How else do you have an ineffective institution, Congress, that has only a 15% approval rating, yet 90% of its members get reelected every 2 years? Very few seats in Congress are contested in an across-the-board general election. By some estimates, only 35 of the total of 435. The only real threat to an incumbent's survival is a primary challenge from the ideological fringes. For a Republican, the extreme right, and for a Democrat, the extreme left. Ideological purity, demagoguery are therefore incentivized. Political courage, independence, and compromise for the sake of governing are punished. At present, 6 states have adopted independent redistricting commissions composed of citizens, not politicians, to draw legislative districts at the state and federal level, resulting in more competitive seats in federal and state legislatures. Likewise, some states like California have adopted an open primary system. These reforms should be expanded to more states, in my view. Both have the effect of requiring politicians to appeal to a broader ideological swath of voters to get elected and re-elected. Ranked choice voting is a concept that should be explored too. Having said all that, I leave you with what I hope is a note of optimism. Shortly before he died at age 63 in 1945, President Roosevelt had that vision that the trend of civilization is forever upward. Just before he died at age 63 in 1956, Dr. Johnson, my grandfather, wrote an essay in the New York Times entitled "A Southern Negro's View of the South," charting the sociologist's course for the civil rights movement that was about to come. For this essay, Dr. Johnson received many congratulatory letters, including one from a young Baptist preacher in Montgomery, Alabama, named Martin Luther King, proclaiming that the essay was the best statement I have read in the whole subject area. Quote from Dr. King, "You combine in this article the fact-finding mind of the social scientist with the moral insights of a religious prophet." What did my grandfather write that moved Dr. King to such lofty praise? I'm sure it was one passage in his essay which lives in my DNA, describing the Southern blacks' predicament in the Jim Crow South in 1956. Dr. Johnson said, quote, "There is no sense of hopelessness in this situation, however uncomfortable and menacing and humiliating it may be at times. Faith in the ultimate strength of the democratic philosophy and code of the nation as a whole has always been stronger than the impulse to despair." Thank you. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much for delivering that here, and especially in honor of Secretary Hagel. And let me just say again, thank you so much for allowing us to build this lecture series in your name. He's doing this because he believes in the country, he believes in the heartland of the country, and without you, sir, we wouldn't be able to bring these voices here to Chicago. And thank you very much. And thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I also want to say thank you to Amanda Woodward. Amanda Woodward has been supportive of our center, has been supportive of our department, has been supportive of the lecture series here from the beginning. And I just can't thank her enough, and I just very much appreciate what you have done here. Thank you so much, Amanda. We have many of our CPOST supporters, many of our Hagel Council here. I want to just say a word of thanks to you. And we couldn't do it without you. Thank you. But I also want to say a big thanks to all the audience here, and also all the serving men and women around the world who are watching us on live stream. Because this is an opportunity for us to talk about some of the most central issues of our country. And let's begin with that. And just so to remind them, after about a half an hour, we're going to take questions from the audience. But where I'd like to begin is I'd like to begin building on not just your experience, your judgment, but your special position as the leaders of the most important departments for the security of our country, Homeland Security and Defense. I'd like to take you back to January 6th. I'd like to ask you two questions related to that.
Not beer, is it?
We made with January 6th.
It gets worse, Jay.
And I'd like to ask you really two questions about this, which is not just what your feelings were when you watched what happened on January 6th, but you saw this from a position where you saw the commander-in-chief, you saw the president do things. And you're watching this also from the position of somebody who in the cabinet, now of course not in that president's cabinet, but I'd like you to just tell us your thoughts about what's going through your mind as you're watching the boss, the president, pushing these events. And then I'd also like to ask you to bring that a little more forward to today and talk a bit about the guardrails to democracy. Are they stronger today than they were on January 6th?
So I'll start. The most shocking image to me on January 6th was, I have an ancestor who fought in the Civil War. The most shocking image to me was a Confederate flag paraded through the halls of the U.S. Capitol, which had never occurred before that day, not during the Civil War, not at any other time, not in the depths of the Civil Rights Movement, and of course the violence. We had a president who both incited the insurrection and who also happened to be the commander-in-chief of all the firemen. And that's a dangerous place to be in our democracy. And what we discovered, you know, we like to say we're the most enduring democracy in the world, as I said, but what we discovered is our democracy is frail. There's a lot of gray in our Constitution and our constitutional norms. And up until recently, we've had the benefit of presidents, senators, members of Congress who were wise, mature people who respected constitutional norms and didn't try to exploit the gray and didn't try to push that envelope to the point where it might break. We're stronger now in the sense that it's happened, and I hope we've learned from it. Congress has revised the Electoral Count Act to take out some of the vagaries there in how we count electoral college votes. Just recently, I was part of a group that made a recommendation to Congress for ways we can tighten up the Insurrection Act, which is a very, very old law with a lot of broad, vague, antiquated terms. And so we're stronger in the sense that we're legally smarter. But as I said in my remarks, and as your research reveals, that boiling pot of water is still there. It's still out there. That didn't go away magically on January 7th. It's still there. So those are my thoughts.
Well, first, let me thank you, Jay, for taking some time to come in and participate in our annual event. And to you, Bob, for your continued leadership in this institution. Madam Dean, for your support, and everybody here who has been supportive of what you're doing, which is very, very important. As to your question, as I watched that unfold on January 6th, it was a jolting gong of reality that was unfolding in this country. Most of us, I think, had always believed that we wouldn't see anything like that for obvious reasons, but we did. And it was an awakening for us. I mean, much of what you're doing and have been doing the last few years revolves around that. What Jay's comments were tonight in his remarks is essentially all about that. And I think for me, as I thought through this, it wasn't just that jolt, but it was the responsibility of average citizens. That we've been lazy, quite frankly. We've had it pretty good in this country since the end of World War II. We built a world order that's been tremendously successful for us, for our allies, for most of the world. We've made mistakes. We'll continue to make mistakes. But when you think of the things that have happened that are positive in this country, because we worked together for the last 70 years, certainly, we compromised. Some of the things that Jay was talking about, how you could be a Democrat or Republican, and I saw it for 12 years in the Senate. And most of that time, I had the pleasure, really, of working with people on both sides of the aisle who would make the country better. You would compromise. In a democracy, there's no alternative to compromise except one. That's authoritarian government. And we as citizens have kind of lost track of all that over the years because we've been absorbed in our own personal interests. And there's nothing wrong with that, absolutely. But we've lost track, I think, of there's a responsibility that goes with being a productive citizen. And that is being aware of what's going on in your country and adding to it. I'll end this way. One of the things that I've done over the years, we're going to have the 7th, I think, next year, absolutely this fall at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, is I started a public service symposium for high school seniors. Because I've believed over the years that we have given short shrift to public service, especially with young people. We've made fun of public service. Too many politicians over the years have talked about public service as stupid and lazy. They couldn't do anything else, and Washington is an example of that, the swamp. As I often used to remind my colleagues who would make these political statements, well, who protects the country? These are stupid political servants and lazy. Who makes sure that your parents and your grandparents get Social Security checks? Who protects the skies in this country for safety? Who gets the Medicare treatments to the senior citizens? Those are all stupid, lazy people. That's just but one example. Well, and one little thing that I try to do to help imbue at least our young people to some awareness of the importance of public service. And it cuts, it seems to me, to your question of what happened on January 6th. The people who participated in that, I doubt if they've ever spent much time in their young careers dealing with public service, contributing, making the world better. John F. Kennedy said it pretty plainly. And we don't all have to be John F. Kennedys, but Ronald Reagan talked about it. I mean, it's bipartisan. So overall, I think, and I hope, we're going to be a better country for really what happened there. We always have been, we make mistakes, but we have this great ability in this country, and I think it's unique in the world, to self-correct. Because we have a Constitution, 27 amendments to the Constitution, because we didn't get it all right the first time. And we're still working on issues. We don't have it all right. But our people I've always believed this country is imbued with good people. But leadership matters. Getting to Jay's point, you get wrong leaders, bad leaders. It doesn't make any difference about the institution, business, education, politics. Bad things happen that come from bad leaders. So those are some of the things that went through my mind when I watched what happened on January 6th.
Very, very helpful. And let me build on this in the following way. Here at Chicago, around the world, I'm sure both of you, we have been involved in discussions about strengthening guardrails since January 6th and solutions. And we're going to talk about some solutions in just a little bit, but I want to start with something that just occurred yesterday and gets my attention because I'm wondering if we are facing the possible weakening of guardrails in the near future. So the Supreme Court just met yesterday, had hearings on the issue of presidential immunity. may come as a surprise, but we have never, the Supreme Court has never cut out and carved out something for the president immunity in all of the history of our country ever. But that happened starting yesterday. Now, we don't know what they're going to decide. We can kind of guess and read tea leaves, and that's all over the newspapers. But what I'd like to do is I'd like to just circle back to what's happening since January 6th, and also to have you talk to us about the consequences of different ways to think about presidential immunity and going forward, because this to me really worries me, because we talk about we should strengthen, but are we actually weakening guardrails?
Well, I have to say I'm stunned that there are justices on the Supreme Court, with all due respect to the Supreme Court, that would even entertain this notion. And my other thought was, Richard Nixon from his grave is probably thinking, where were you 50 years ago when I needed you? Because, you know, if that's true, then Ford didn't need to pardon Nixon. And Nixon would have been right when he said, if the president does it, it is not illegal. Of course the president's not above the law. And, you know, one of the questions from the bench yesterday was, well, don't we need to craft some form of immunity to protect the president so he can do his job? Well, wait a minute. In any decision-making process, in national security in particular, you know, the use of lethal force, for example, that decision comes up through an entire chain of command, and the Secretary of Defense is part of it. And every person in that chain of command has a lawyer that signs off on the operation before it works its way up the chain. So by the time it gets to the president, a whole lot of people with a whole lot of lawyers have looked at it and to ensure that what everyone in the chain of command, including the people down in the military part of the command, what they are doing is lawful. If all of a sudden there's this notion that the president is criminally immune from his actions, then you don't need to have that system anymore. It doesn't need to be as rigorous anymore. And I come back to what I said before. It's absurd that we're even having this debate, because we never had this debate before. The notion that somehow the Supreme Court needs to protect the president from criminal liability would never have occurred 10, 20, 30 years ago, because we've always elected capable, honest, trustworthy people to the highest office in the country. And the notion that the president needs to be protected from prosecutors is just nuts up until now. So,
well, I agree with everything that Jeh has said. In my opinion, this is one of the defining times in the history of this country, the period that we're going through right now. Because if we don't come out of this on the right side, in the right way, dealing with these threats, then this country, for the first time in 250 years, will make your grandfather's comments, FDR's comments, other great leaders we've had in this country at the right time, at the most defining times in the history of America, starting with Washington, Lincoln, FDR. You go right down through the presidents who have had the most impact on the future of this country. If we don't get this right, the right way, over the next few years, then we will be going the wrong way in history. And I'm an optimist, but I'm a realist too. And I think it'll be very difficult to turn that around. All the dynamics and dimensions of our lives today, social media, Gallup's poll every year on the lack of trust among Americans in its institutions, the 15 most important institutions in this country, education being one of them, judiciary being one, the media being one. Lack of trust in those institutions. And when a society doesn't trust or lose confidence in its very institutions that are most important in our day-to-day lives, that society is in trouble. I think we're at a period here where it's still to be determined, and I think that's good. But that's why I say this is really a defining time. It's not going to be fixed after this election or in the next few years, but we've got to start to turn it around and find the leaders, because leadership matters, as I said, we all know. And that's going to be part of it. But in a democracy, it doesn't start with the leaders. It starts down here, because all decision making in a democracy begins at a ballot box, and that's the citizens of a country.
Right, you know, there was a time in the early 60s when, you know, you'd ask in polls, do you trust your government to do the right thing? And it was always in the 70% range. Now it's the inverse. I saw a poll not too long ago that asked that same question, category by category, different areas of government. Interestingly, disaster relief was right up there with the U.S. military. This was just maybe 10 years ago. I hope that's still true.
In our surveys, we actually had to invent a new category because asking if you trust government was too weak. We started to ask, is government the enemy?
Yeah,
it was just
right,
stunning.
Right.
I'd like to, though, shift over to some discussion about drivers and solutions. So, Secretary Johnson, you very helpfully laid out discussion of gerrymandering as a key problem and have a very excellent idea about how to approach this. And this, I think, needs to have much greater voice. But I would like to, especially because you were Secretary of Homeland Security, talk about immigration. The issue of immigration is an issue physically, it's an issue on the border, but in our surveys it shows it's a driver of some of those fears of a great replacement. You're probably very familiar with this.
Yes.
What the audience probably doesn't realize is while you were Secretary of Homeland Security, the border problem was down here. And then when Trump came in, the crossings went up to here, and now they've continued to go up.
Yes.
So the trajectory here is not Democrat up, Republican down. It's quite the opposite. In fact, anybody could go to Google and find this trajectory.
Well, so when I was in office, probably around 2015, I saw a poll. This is 2014, my first full year in office. I saw a poll. Do you believe that the immigration problem is worse now than it was 10 years ago? And the poll came back and said yes, when the opposite was true. Because of the way it's presented in the media and the hysteria, everyone thought, oh my God, it's terrible. And so I embarked on basically a speaking tour around the country, in Arizona, Texas, speech after speech. Look at these numbers. Look at this. You know, I was the Bob Pape of the Department of Homeland Security.
I want to be the Jeh Johnson.
Look at these.
No, I think it goes the other way.
Data to show border crossings are way down. My second full year in office, we had 315,000 total border crossings on the southern border. Second lowest number since 1972.
Amazing.
It crept up a little bit in 2016. When Trump took office in 2017, it dropped for a short period of time. And then it started creeping back up again. And by 2019, there were 1 million border crossings. And it's continued to go up. Now, why is this happening? Because I owned this problem for 3 years. There's a hemispheric shift now northward. It's much bigger than when I was in office. There are also magnets in our broken immigration system to illegal immigration, the way the asylum process works, the backlog, and so forth, that serve as magnets. But the push factors always overwhelm whatever defense you can put up on the southern border. So in order to deal with the problem, you've got to deal with it at the source. A lot of people don't want to hear that. They want quick and easy solutions. You got to deal with it at the source, and we have to somehow get the Mexicans to do more on their southern border with Central America, which is just 300 miles versus 1,900 miles. It's an incredibly emotional issue. A lot of it is just plain racism. They're concerned about the browning of America, the great replacement. They're taking our place. They're replacing us. You strip away all of that. I mean, I do believe that we have a legitimate interest in border security. I think, strip away the racist red meat demagoguery. I think Americans are entitled to believe that the most powerful nation on earth can secure its perimeter. And we should be able to deliver on border security. And there are ways to do this. There are practical solutions to border security, to immigration reform. Somebody in Washington has in their top desk drawer a 10-point plan for border security, but it's become so politicized that the politicians would rather have this as an issue to demagogue than to fix the issue. And the proof of that is Jim Lankford and Chris Murphy and Kirsten Sinema negotiated a really strong bipartisan border security solution, which they said, here, look, we did it. And it went nowhere because certain politicians in an election year would rather have this as an issue to complain about than to actually fix the problem.
So because this issue, before Chuck, I'm going to come to you about this, but I'd like to just ask Secretary Johnson just one more question, then I want to come to you on a related issue of immigration. Because this is driving so much anger right now, I'd like to ask you if you would just unpack and make a little clearer to the audience. Most of the audience thinks, because the public is being told this in the media, you got to fix the immigration problem at the border of Texas and Mexico. I believe, sir, you have some other ideas about this more specifically, and I think it would be helpful for folks to hear more widely what smart ideas here would really look like.
This is the lesson. This is the hard lesson I learned managing this problem. Illegal immigration is a very information-sensitive phenomenon. It reacts sharply to perceived information about our enforcement posture. So if all of a sudden people in Central America and South America perceive that we're cracking down, we're getting tough on our southern border, the numbers will fall off very quickly, but only short term. And if they perceive it's lax, the numbers are going to climb up very quickly. But so long as we fail to address the underlying push factors, the famine, the poverty, the drought, the corruption, the violence, the gang violence that are forcing families to make this basic choice in the first place, so long as we don't deal with that, the numbers always revert back to their longer term trend line. And so we can continue to bang our head against the wall and try to deal with this at the border, but as long as those powerful push factors persist, they're gonna keep coming. And you can't, first of all, you can't build a wall across a 1,900-mile border because our southern border is the Rio Grande, which is a windy river. It's mountains, it's desert. There's no point in building a 10-foot wall on top of a 10,000-foot mountain. There are smart ways to deal with border security, but there's only so much defense you can throw with this. You got to deal with the problem at the source.
Thank you because I don't think enough Americans hear that. And Secretary Hagel, I'd like to ask you something related to this, but from a little different vantage point. So what we have just seen, Secretary Johnson mentioned this, is the failure of Congress to be able to deal with border security and the border this year. But we've just seen, even though it was very, very difficult, very, very close, we finally were able to push through aid for Ukraine. We finally were able to push through things with Israel. Now, I'd like to ask you, and this touches on both your experience as a senator and also Secretary of Defense, if you can really help us understand, yes, these are both important, and I'm very glad about the latter, I'm disturbed about the former, but can you give us some insight into why it's actually harder to solve the problem here with the border when a lot of folks think that this is the more urgent, the more immediate problem, and they're just scratching their heads. It's not they don't want the Ukraine to go away, it's just why can we deal with what many folks would say is the secondary problem and not the primary one?
Well, I think part of the answer is Jay gave it to you. Starting with one of the first things that he said, you've got quite, and I don't want to make this into a Republican-Democrat deal, but we're talking about reality and we're talking about honesty. Over my career, I've always tried to be direct and honest when I ask a question. That always has not worked in my favor, however. But that said, what Jay said is that we've got one party that refused to deal with this with a solution that had been presented by a bipartisan group of senators, Republicans and Democrats, a solution to start dealing with this. The Republicans in the House said, no, we're not going to deal with it. They're going to use it, want to use it for a campaign issue. But that's essentially about as irresponsible approach to governing that I know of. That's a clear example. So that's part of it. Second, you've got all these different elements involved in this issue, border security. Jay's talked about them. You've got security, you've got economic reality, you've got biases by different people. These immigrants are taking our jobs. I mean, factually, all of that is so untrue. I mean, this economy could not operate without immigrants. I mean, my state of Nebraska could not operate without immigrants. And let's start here. We're all products of immigration. Everybody here. You just weren't, all of a sudden, your family dropped in here. You go back a few generations and we all are products of that process. But you've got the world so upside down today, and this country's so polarized and divided today, that somehow we can't see our way through to come up with common sense, practical solutions to these big issues. I mean, everything Jay said was, I can hardly improve on any of that because he said it right and he said it honestly. And so you've got the national security issue, which is being used by one group of people. And then all the economic issues, and then so many insecurity of bringing people in. All of these are factors, and so that's, I think, where you have to start, and you'll not fix that until you start to bring stability into governance and into the decision-making process in Washington. Now, maybe that starts to change after we have an election. I think it's not going to change a lot. I think it can get better, but it can get worse too. So I don't know if I've hit on your question, but I think it includes all of the things that Jay was talking about, and the bigger issues that we've just been talking about. And this is one of those issues that is so intense. And I'll wind up this way by addressing, I think, the other point, maybe your main point, on how can this country say that Ukraine and Taiwan is maybe more important funding them than the border, because we passed a $95 billion supplemental to do what I think is critically important for the future of this country, and that is the funding for our allies. I mean, some people have said, well, this is an investment in America's stability and future so that you don't have American troops over in Eastern Europe stopping Putin where we could have stopped him before if we would have supported our allies and our friends. I mean, that might be a little crass way to say it, but it's exactly right. One of the reasons, and it may be as important as any, for the success of this country the last 75 years, and it was the world order that we built after World War II, is because of our allies and because of our friends and partners. We couldn't project power in our Defense Department in the world today if we did not have those relationships. Because if we didn't have countries that allowed us to use their bases and station our troops, now, it's in their interest too, but that affects trade, that affects diplomacy, that affects our economics, the economics of the region, of those countries. It affects our security. I mean, so much of our success in keeping peace in the world has been directly related to the importance of why we help fund the security of, obviously, Ukraine, Taiwan, our friends in the Pacific, NATO countries. So I think we've somehow lost track of that in this country, that we're wasting our money giving it to the Ukrainians. I mean, this stupid notion that the Speaker of the House champions is that, oh, well, aren't we great and smart because some of that money that we're going to give them is going to be a loan. Oh, come on. I mean, don't you understand the basics here of how this is such a clear investment in our future and the future peace, and not only of Europe, but how China sees this, what their response is going to be if we let Putin take Ukraine, because Moldova will be next. Poland, you probably have read, all these Eastern European countries are increasing their defense structures. They're starting to talk about new conscription programs to bring their young people in. The consequences of all of this are there. So it's a long answer to your question, but I think it needs to all be focused on to really get a answer.
And let me just build on what you said, sir, about Putin, and go and connect it to the issue of our democracy, because the issue of foreign actors, foreign interference in our elections, that's an issue. In the public, we know Russia has the Internet Research Agency. We know that they have been, a lot of great powers have tried to play games with the candidates of other countries, including the United States has played those games for quite some time. But in the Internet-charged world we live in, now we have a lot of opportunities for those foreign actors to do things to amplify divisions, to make countries even more angry. And I just want to stay with Russia here for a moment, because Russia can do that in Ukraine, can do it elsewhere, can do it in the United States. It also happened back to when you were Secretary of Homeland Security. And sir, building on something that they won't know but you said today, can you just talk to us about Russian interference in elections? And also, can you say a little bit about what do you see as the gap between what the insiders know and what the public knows on this issue? Because see, for most of the public, they can't quite get a
when it
handle
comes
on
to, I said earlier in a private discussion, the question people always used to ask me when I was in office is, what keeps you up at night? Everything keeps me up at night. The real question to ask somebody in national security is, how big a gap is there between what you know and what I know as a member of the public? And so I think when it comes to Russian interference in the 2016 election, the public knows just about everything there is to know, except perhaps sources and methods. But when we first uncovered what the Russians were doing in about summer of 2016, I was very concerned that there was going to be an attempt through a cyber attack to somehow manipulate voting, actual voting, and reporting of voting on election night. And we were able, in that highly contested election year, to get a lot of states, red and blue, to seek our cybersecurity assistance at DHS to shore up their vulnerabilities in their election infrastructure. And just before I left office, somebody told me, you have the power to declare something critical infrastructure. I said, I do? Really? How many different agencies of government do I have to coordinate that with? No, just you can do it right. So I declared election infrastructure to be critical infrastructure in our country. The Trump administration, John Kelly, reaffirmed it, even though a lot of state secretaries of state viewed it as somehow the federal government trying to take over, but we stuck to it. What we didn't see at the time was that the Russians had infiltrated our American conversation, our social media. We now know, I think, about everything there is to know through the Mueller report, through various indictments, through the public reporting of this. And that hasn't been shut down. And there's no reason to believe Putin has walked away from that. And I suspect, I don't read intel anymore, but I suspect that there are other governments that are up to the same thing. And a lot of the problem here tracks back to what Chuck was saying earlier. Americans need to take more responsibility here. You know, Americans need to be more scrutinizing in what they consume for their news and their information. You don't have to believe every single thing you read in social media. A lot of us run to the most extreme news organizations that reaffirm our own suspicions, our own biases, where a lot of this garbage is fed. And if we could somehow take more personal responsibility for reading and consuming more conventional news that has standards, I think we'd all be better off, because we'd be working from the same sheet of music. We could form our own judgments and opinions about things, but we're working off the same set of facts. And the problem with social media is there are few barriers for entry. It's anybody with a keyboard, and few standards for exit. And we always it's human nature to look for things that reaffirm our own biases, which is part of the reason we are where we are right now, where you have so many Americans believing that the election in 20 was rigged. One day my son, this was maybe 10 years ago, my son he had invited his best friend over for breakfast with us, and we're sitting at the breakfast table, and he said with a straight face, "I don't believe 9/11 happened." I think it was a huge government cover-up. And my son said, "Well, you realize that if that's true, then my dad right here is paying for your breakfast as part of that cover-up." But it's because he's able to find something on social media that feeds him that crap. So and that is the environment in which foreign governments, foreign interests can infiltrate our conversation.
Chuck, could you offer your thoughts about, are we taking that foreign threat seriously enough? Are we doing it about right? Should we be doing more in that regard? Or how would you put this in the landscape of the problems we face?
Well, because that threat that you're talking about has gotten so much attention in the media, newspapers, I mean everything. There's nobody who's conscious that's not unaware of those, at least of the conversations and the stories. Now, whether you accept that or not, that's another thing. But I think the majority of this country recognize this is a serious issue. Where would they rank that with the serious issues in their opinion? I don't know. But it kind of goes back, I think, to what we've been talking about a little bit, is the lack of trust in all these stories that come out. Well, I don't know, is it really that bad? I mean, come on, I hear about it, but that's the government talking about it, and on and on and on. And then you have members of Congress who just poo-poo it, who just, it's not that serious, it's not that big a deal. So I think it goes back to the real basic issue as much as anything in this country on trust. If you can't trust the media, I mean, basically, just generally, is the media honest or not honest? And if you say, well, they're not honest, boy, then who do you trust? I mean, Jay alluded to this. I mean, do you trust what you hear through social media or through somebody else or this young friend of your son's who, I don't know if that really happened. And it's hard to get people's attention once there's a question about the legitimacy of those stories. So, what do I think? Is there enough of awareness? Probably not, and I not that there's not an awareness, but I would say it differently. Is there a belief that it's a serious issue? I think that's the issue. And when you've got members of Congress who minimize it, people just shrug their shoulders. So I think it's like so many of our issues that we're dealing with. I think it's the legitimacy of the issue in the minds of so many Americans is in question. And you can't solve the problem or you can't address the problem, especially if many of your leaders aren't saying, no, this is a hell of a problem. We better deal with it.
So, folks, I'd like to ask just one more question, and so please get ready for questions on your side. So we'll have a good half hour from the audience for questions. And the last question I'd like to ask has to do with building on this direction of democracy abroad, is the connection between what happens to democracies abroad and what happens to our democracy at home. So President Biden, others have talked about the competition between democracy and autocracy. Sir, in your speech, you talked about how freedom is unfortunately not on the march. But what I'd like to do is ask you if you could help us understand how much it really matters to our democracy here at home. What happens to democracy in Ukraine? What happens to, I don't mean the territory, I mean the democracy part. Democracy in Taiwan. Is it the case that the loss of democracy abroad hurts our democracy here? Or is it the case, as some have argued, that the pursuit of liberalism abroad actually weakens?
I think it's just the reverse.
Please, go right ahead, Chuck.
I think it's just the reverse. I think the world looks to us not as a perfect nation or a perfect process. There is no such thing. But I think so much of the world has, certainly the last 75 years, has viewed us as a model with all our faults. And they've learned from us in many good ways. They picked up some bad habits too. But, and so when they see us so off balance, I think that's a very significant, has a very significant effect and consequence to these democracies. Now, democracies that have been established in our strong democracies in Europe, UK, for example, not so much UK, but emerging democracies, new democracies, certainly in Africa, certainly in Asia, but even in Eastern Europe, that were not democracies until the Soviet Union imploded in the early 90s. No, I think if there's a role model in democracy, I think it's the United States with all our problems. So I would say it's just the opposite. I don't think it's so much what's going on in another country as how we see that affects us. I think it's what those democracies see going on in this country that affects their democracy and affects the world. That may seem to foreigners a bit arrogant, and they may not agree with me on that, but I think the facts are clear on this.
I agree with everything Chuck said. I would add, at a very, very basic level, the reason we have an interest in fostering democracy in other nations is to avoid another migration crisis.
Yep.
When a country's democracy shuts down, it creates a migration crisis. In that hemisphere, in our hemisphere, so we have an interest in stability, democratic stability in our hemisphere, in the other hemispheres, for all of the reasons that Chuck cited about alliances. It's in our interest to have friendly relationships with some of these governments. But I think he's right. I think we have been the model of democracy. A lot of people in the world are scratching their head right now, wondering what's going on in the United States. My hope is that this will pass.
And I might just add one thing. You mentioned President Biden's speeches on, and politically, you wonder whether that's effective or not with all the issues in this country, and they talk about autocracy versus democracy and so on. Does that go over the heads of most people? Is he really connecting politically? And I think that's a fair question. But I applaud him and I appreciate him for talking about this. Because if the President of the United States is not talking about it, then who's going to be talking about it? Not that a congressman or a senator or a governor can't talk about it, but it doesn't resonate like a president. And so I very much appreciate his bringing that point out. And I know some of his political people don't waste a speech on that. I mean, talk to people about the economy and all important. I understand, but somebody at his level. I mean, there are not many people other than the President of the United States at a level comparable, but unless they're talking about it, it just doesn't get any attention.
And if the president can't be the president, who can be the president? So I'd like to open it up to questions, please. Yes, and I don't know if we have the microphone going around, but we should, but so please, yes. And then I'll just kind of work my way around the room, and hopefully the microphone will come here. And then if we can get the microphone here to this gentleman with the glasses, and then what we'll do is, okay.
Bob Devaney's my name, a neighbor here to the campus. You raised the issue, the border isn't the problem, it's the corruption and the unemployment and the poverty south of the border. And I fully sympathize with that. I've lived in Honduras, I've lived in Colombia, and worked there. But how do we as the United States solve those serious problems?
So the last year of the Obama administration, we prevailed upon Congress to appropriate $750 million in foreign assistance, targeted foreign assistance to Central America. Now that's a drop in the bucket. It was a start. And then the next administration suspended it. But the experts in the consulates, in the embassies, in that region will tell you that that drop in the bucket was already beginning to make a difference. It enabled, for example, coffee makers, coffee growers in Guatemala to better get their product to the market, gave people hope there. And we've done this with a Plan Colombia. We've done this kind of thing before. It's an investment. It's an investment over several administrations. It's not a quick solution like shut down the border or reimpose Title 42. But so many of these families are making the decision to leave because the gangs said, I'm taking your son away. If your son doesn't join the gang, we're going to kill him. And so they're making that very basic decision irrespective of who the US president is, irrespective of whether there's a Title 42 or not. They're making the decision that they have to leave. They have no choice. Even if they only get to stay in this country for a couple of years until they're deported, they're better off doing that than taking a risk and staying where they are in Honduras or Guatemala or El Salvador. And so that's a decision to leave a burning building. And we can't change that in Texas or Arizona.
I'll just add to what Jay said, and Jay's exactly right. Just as an example, when I was Secretary of Defense, I took a number of trips down to Central American countries, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, so on, and other countries where we had very quietly had Corps of Engineer projects down in those countries, helping them build schools and dispensaries, because the Defense Department has the money and all the toys and the people. So we can do that. I mean, when the Ebola crisis hit, I think 2014 in West Africa, it was the Defense Department that changed all of that. I mean, HHS was involved and so on, but we had the planes, the people, the doctors,
The money.
the money. We could go in and build facilities and so on. And we stopped it. So there are a lot of ways that, to Jay's point, that we can help, but we've shut all that down. I mean, and that doesn't help the cause, the immigration problem for why these people are
There's a fair amount
leaving.
There's a fair amount that we can do on defense. So in addition to the border, I used to go to Central America and I'd have a press conference with the president of Guatemala, and I'm standing next to him saying to his people, don't come to my country. And I would go to Honduras to the airport and I'd greet the ICE plane coming back and bring the camera crews so people can see that migrants are actually being deported back home, so they can see we're actually sending people back. That slows only a portion of the problem.
Yes, please. And if there might be somebody coming right on the, yes. And then I'll come back to this side in a second.
Two questions, but if you'll indulge me with only one, I'll take it. The first one is this. We have a very antiquated system by which we operate with an electoral college.
I'm sorry, the Electoral College.
The Electoral College. The will of the people is no longer being realized by our population. The winner of the
You realize
election.
we're going to have two different perspectives on this. I'm from New York, he's from Nebraska.
Okay. The winner of the election is no longer being elected. The most recent and obvious case was Hillary Clinton. So my question is there a remedy, constitutional or otherwise, that you foresee that would ever change that so that the majority of the votes, the majority of the people would have an adequate say as to who the president becomes?
Well, in Nebraska, there's actually, they proportion electors by congressional district, which makes some sense. And the problem, however, is that certain states are not going to go to that system unless every state goes to that system. So, everybody's looking at California, which is winner take all with, I think, 55 electoral votes. The Electoral College is a system where winners lose and losers win. And the presidential election is decided, this year will be decided in 6 states. And all the rest of us in New York, New Jersey, Illinois, California are irrelevant.
Right.
And it's worse than that, because it's decided by a handful of swing voters in swing states. It's more exacerbated than it was, say, 50 years ago. And the candidates campaign in a particular way, therefore. If I'm running for president and Ohio, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Wisconsin are the states I need to win, that's how I position my campaign, and that's how I position myself on the issues in the campaign, as opposed to making an effort to appeal to the great masses. And so you have now more than ever the anomaly of the loser winning the popular vote, but losing the electoral college. So, and I
Yeah,
know,
you can imagine that's
Secretary
frustrating.
Hagel-
I'm tired of watching Florida decide who wins.
No, sorry. Can't do it. So what we're going to do is give everybody one question. If there's time, we'll give you a chance to circle back.
Fair enough, thank you.
Because otherwise we won't be
But
fair
I'm
to
sure Chuck has a different view on the electoral college.
Well, briefly, I would say that there's no perfect system, because the reason the Electoral College was put in place was for the little states. It's why we have a Senate. I mean, the United States Senate was a compromise for the little states, because if you didn't have that, then the big states would, with populations, they'd control everything all the time. So that's why they gave each North Dakota, Nebraska, South Dakota, the same number of senators that California and New York has. And I think that was the right thing to do, not just because I'm from Nebraska, but I think it was the fair thing to do. But it's always imperfect. But back to your question, I mean, we could do that. I mean, probably it isn't going to happen in my lifetime that we're going to change that system for obvious reasons. But it would take a constitutional amendment and 2/3 vote and so on and so on. And then all the states would have to ratify it. So unless I, live to be 150, maybe.
We're working on that.
Well, thank you. Well, so am I. I mean, drinking water and, so. But if you went for just straight populations, I mean, look at the strength California has in about 10 states that have all the populations. So little Nebraska, Wyoming, these little states, they'd get no attention at all. I mean, at least now we get some attention because you get, well, the last 2 or 3 months in the political reporting about why that one electoral vote in Omaha, Nebraska, which went for Biden in 2020 and Obama the first time in 2008 may be a deciding factor. Well, for Nebraska, people pay attention. Somebody's probably going to have to come out there, maybe Biden and Trump both, but not just because you want the attention, but you want the attention of the leaders to say, well, this is our issue too. So, I get both sides of the argument, and it isn't just because I'm from Nebraska, but I think that the founders had a reason that they put the Electoral College in place.
Well, no, we'll definitely give it a chance.
You can argue this all night long, but
if we get a chance, sir, we'll definitely. It's
Talk
okay.
to you after.
Please, on this side. Yeah. Excellent question.
Hi, my name is Yang, graduate student in sociology. I want to zero in on the question of incentives in the party and the performance of democracy. The GOP today looks less like a political party than a collection of hundreds of political entrepreneurs, many treating the offices as platforms for individual brand building rather than places to work with other politicians to pass laws. To add insult to injury, Republicans have known from the beginning that they would all be better off with Trump gone, but also that anyone who tried to make that happen would risk the anger of his voters. So my question is, instead of staying quiet on the sidelines in hopes of that fate would intervene, how to overcome collective action problem in the more divided GOP? What institutional reforms that can be made to change the incentives in the party system that in turn improves the performance of democracy?
So, this is true of both parties. I'm going to give a bipartisan answer here. For your average member of Congress, if you're a sitting Republican, you're more concerned in a Republican district in, say, Texas, you're more concerned about a challenge from your right than a challenge from the opposing party. So if I'm a Republican in a Republican district in Texas, I not only have to be Republican, I got to be far right Republican, or I got to make sure I'm pandering to that base. And if I'm a Democrat in a Democratic leaning district, I have to be concerned about a challenge from the far left. So, as I said in my remarks, ideological purity is survival. And in that environment, there's no political incentive for compromise. So you end up in a situation where on the Republican side, everybody's afraid of Trump. No one wants to be seen as less than pure. No one wants to be seen as moderate, as willing to work with the other side. And that's how you end up in a situation where nothing gets done. And we're polarized, and even, a common sense solution to what some would believe is the number one problem in America, immigration, is cast off because nobody wants to exercise the political courage to vote for it. They'd rather have the issue. I'd rather be in a position where I call the guy in the other party weak or evil or whatever than to actually work with him to come up with a solution where I get something and he gets something and the people's problem is solved.
Well, I'm a Republican. I don't know what the hell that means, but your description of the Republican Party today is pretty close to reality, I think. I mean, I've said what the Republican Party is today, in my opinion, is a tribe. It's an amalgamation of different tribes. And the only way that's going to change, and it will change, is the only way it's going to change soon, and I believe it will change soon, is if Trump loses this election, because we have very little courage today in politics. And I would say not just Republicans, but Democrats, that too many politicians define themselves or see themselves by their title. Well, I'm a United States Senator or I'm a Congressman, so I can't jeopardize that. That's who I am. Now, you're a lot more than a senator or a congressman or a former secretary. You're Jeh Johnson, Bob Pape, you're who you are. I mean, just incidentally, you're something else. But don't take that approach to elective office, because you'll be a failure. And at some point in your life, you'll review that and you won't be happy with yourself. Mm-hmm. And until we find some new courage, in both parties, but you ask about the Republican Party, because Trump's, in my opinion, he's so kowtowed everybody, and they're so afraid of him. But if he loses in November, and I think he will, I mean, we've got a lot of, it's going to happen in the next 6 months. But you look at what's happened. If he loses in November, what's happened in the Republican Party, that would mean that the Republican Party has lost the last 4 elections. They lost it 2018, 2020, 2022, then 2024. It will implode. Whatever the Republican Party is today, it will implode. And it will dissolve very quickly. And you will find new leaders emerge very quickly. Not MAGA, not Trump, because they've been losers. They've taken the Republican Party down a real disastrous path. And they're going to have to build back, or they may become inconsequential, because it will fragment. And I mean, the Democratic Party has some of that as well. I mean, if Biden's elected, I mean, he's going to be 82 years old. I mean, so you've got a party led by an 82-year-old. But as I tell people, I mean, elections are about choices. This is your choice, Biden or Trump, and you decide. But both parties are going to have consequences in the future, regardless of who wins this election.
So, someone on this side, possibly? Yes, please. Right here.
There's a lot of talk about democracy, and rightly so. The one word that's always missing from the national conversations is republic. We are a democratic republic, which means some people know better than some other people some of the time about some things, which is antithetical to the lack of respect for authority, which I feel 2 steps back underscores so much of what we're talking about systemically. But republic is a subject that deserves a lot more attention from those of you who are bringing attention to these intractable problems. Thank you.
Could you spell that out a little bit more, please?
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Yep.
Some people know better than some other people some of the time, and the founders very firmly understood that the tyranny of the masses is something that needs to be protected against. The Electoral College, and my neighbor took my follow-up question right out of my mouth, which was going to be to ask you directly, are you in favor of the abolition of the Electoral College?
I'm
Yes.
not. He is. I'm
Yeah.
not.
Yes, but it's not going to happen.
2 to 1.
It's not going to happen. I would do away with it tomorrow if I could. Let me address the first part of your statement. I used to be a jury trial lawyer. I tried a case to a jury in January. That was the last jury case I would try. I'm 66. I'm too old for this stuff. But I used to try a lot of jury cases. Collectively, 12 jurors have a perfect recollection of events. And collectively, 12 people off the street, randomly selected for a jury, are pretty smart and pretty wise, with a lot of common sense. And so I wouldn't count out the masses. It's just that our leaders, our elected leaders, are not acting in accordance with the will of the masses. That's how I see it. They're acting in accordance with the loudest voices in the masses. And so I do believe in the principle of democracy. I mean, are there people more capable of, one question I always ask elected members of Congress is it your role to simply vote in accordance with the will of your constituents, or is it your role to lead and to lead them to a better, more informed place and explain your vote to them and why it's good for them, even though they don't fully understand it? And it's probably a little bit of both.
I'll give you a quote that I think addresses this by Edmund Burke, who many of you know who he was, a great conservative leader in Great Britain, 19th century. And he once said, and I think this defines it, your representative owes you not only his industry, but his judgment as well. And he betrays rather than serves you if he sacrifices it to your opinion. Now that may seem a little arrogant, but when you vote for somebody, you vote for that person partly, maybe mainly, because you trust their judgment. You're not going to agree with them on every vote. I mean, in 12 years in the Senate, it never happened to me that somebody agreed with me on every vote I cast, thousands. But I think Burke had it pretty accurate. And I don't think people think about it, get that cerebral when they vote. But this is why we talk today about where I think a lot of the problems with the Republican Party started is this absolutism. We're absolutely right all the time. You're absolutely wrong all the time. I mean, you'd start with Newt Gingrich in 1994 contract with America. Then Grover Norquist signed this, no new taxes. And then we got to the Tea Party and so on and so on. So you didn't respect another person's opinion. You didn't have anything to do with the Democratic Party. You're all idiots because we're the only ones smart enough to know anything. And the only alternative to that is back where we started, authoritarian government. Because democracy, republic, can only survive with compromise.
Please, yes, Rick.
Thank you, Bob. Very illuminating, but also rightfully very troubling. I'd like to ask the two secretaries, mixing metaphors. You've raised a lot of pots boiling. In my view, there are many pots. You've also, although neither of you are still in the cabinet, are insomniacs. So my question is really, what one thing each of you keeps you most awake at night in the run-up to the election, just focusing on our country?
So what keeps me up most at night? Look, I'll be honest and say I worry that Donald Trump's going to be elected again, and it's going to be very different, because he won't have a team of people around him that include people who agreed to serve the nation. He won't have a Jim Mattis, he won't have a Rex Tillerson, he won't have a John Kelly around him who, for at least the first 2 years of his presidency, he listened to. Now he thinks he knows better. If he gets elected again, he'll definitely think he knows better. And there's going to be a real dearth of people, responsible, seasoned, experienced, level-headed people who are going to want to serve in his cabinet. And that's a really dangerous mix. You're going to have people, you're going to have Stephen Miller times 10, or people who are just pure opportunists. And a lot of people be in his cabinet who are serving in acting roles because the Senate won't confirm them. And that's a really, and he's full of vengeance. So that's a really, really dangerous mix. I can't imagine how government is going to function in that environment.
Well, if I had to pick one thing, I would say the future of representative democracy for America. That probably says it all for me. I mean, yes, I'm concerned about Trump being elected for the reasons that Jay noted, but the future of representative democracy in this country. I think I said earlier this evening that I think we're living at a defining time. And that's partly what I mean. And how we come out of this the next few years is going to define the future of this country.
But on the bright side, elections, as Chuck has said, elections are a choice. And I'm not a big believer in polls. A poll is like a stock price. You know, just because Amazon is trading at $30 a share today doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be trading at $30 a share in November. An election result is a moment in time, and you know, I tend to believe people act out in polls, but when they get into the voting machine, common sense does tend to kick in. At least that's my hope.
If I could just interject the flip side of this and tell a little bit of a story. So as you know, we did focus groups and we asked all the problems. At the end of every focus group, though, we asked what was not wrong with America, what was good about America.
Yep.
And even the most extreme radicals on both sides had very similar answers. So I'd like to ask you, just the flip side of what Rick Solomon asked, what gets you up in the morning?
What gets me up in this morning is
Coffee.
Coffee, right. Coffee and the dog. The dog got me up at 4:45 this morning.
You should get a cat.
We had one of those too, but he ran away. The dog chased him away. What gets me up in the morning is I love this country. I love our history. I love our diversity. I love our culture. I love the life my family and I have built for ourselves. Do I love my job? Most days, yes. And I wouldn't live anyplace else. And I believe it's going to get better. We've come this far. When I ask people who've been around politics a lot longer than me, have you ever seen it this bad? And they'll say, oh, it was really worse. In 1964, it was terrible. Or in 1957, it was really bad, and this happened, and this happened. This is nothing compared to that. So I still am essentially an optimist. And I love this country, and I want to make it better. As long as I'm physically able to participate in our democracy, I tend to be active in trying to help, from my vantage point as a private citizen, steer us in the right direction.
I agree with everything my former cabinet colleague just said. You know, that's been my life since I left government, what you just said, trying to make a better world. And as much as anything else, what I admire about this country, and I'm blessed to live at this time with all the issues, is we all have opportunities to help make a better world for all people. If we just take them, I mean, they're out there. I mean, just don't need to be president of the United States or a senator or former cabinet member. I mean, but just do small things for people, just every day. And education is so important. But that's what I'm grateful for. But that's why I also believe in the future of this country. And I think the only way we can go forward is that we've got to be honest, as we've been tonight. And everybody knows the challenges that we have. I mean, you can't sweep them under the rug. You got to be honest with them, and that's what America's always done very well. We've taken issues on. We disagree. We move forward. We self-correct. We get better, and we've got a lot of problems. But boy, you think there's no country on earth even close to this country with the opportunities we have to not just make a better world for everybody, but make a better world for ourselves, for our family. So. Yeah, I'm an optimist. I'm a realist. I get it. The older I get, I was talking to my brothers the other day, and we're all closer to 80 than we are 70. And I said to him, I started laughing. I said, sometimes I catch myself. My God, I'm sounding like our grandfather. You know, you kids don't work hard enough. You know. But, you know, it's just the way it is, and so I'll take this country anytime, any day.
Yeah.
Please, yes, in the middle. Yeah, yes, that's you, and I don't know if they can get the microphone to you, but see, it helps with the folks on the live stream. So it's
while she's doing that, the most favorite thing I got to do as DHS secretary, and there weren't a lot of fun things, and when you're DHS, was a naturalization ceremony.
Oh, yeah.
If anybody's ever feeling down about this country, come to a naturalization ceremony. You see a group maybe this size of people who have worked hard for years to get to that moment, studying the Constitution, and they're all holding American flags, and they bring their families, and it's the happiest day in their life that they became an American. And I'd always tell them the same thing. When this day forward, when you're in a cab or something, somebody looks at you and looks at your skin color or the texture of your hair, or hears your accent, or looks at how you're dressed, and they ask you, where are you from? You say, I'm an American, just like you. Because, as Chuck pointed out, we're all from someplace else here. There's no race of American people. And that's one of the things I love about this country, and we have to remember that there are people around the world who would love to become Americans.
You know, Jay, I think that's the strength of this country. I mean, we've got a lot of strengths, but I think that is the one strength. There's no one just naturally born American.
Yep.
Yeah. We're from all over, religions, colors. I mean, that's, I think, the strength.
Ronald Reagan said it best. One of his last speeches as president, he actually was a campaign speech for George Bush. He said, you can go to Japan and never be Japanese, you can go to Germany and never be German, you can go to France and never be French, but you can come to America and be an American. I think that says it all.
We're going to try to get one more question here. Yes.
Thank you.
It's always that last question that's a killer. I was in a school, and all these kids have their hands up, and I really got to go. And then this one kid is, oh, and then all the other kids are calling him. I said, okay, all right, what's your question? He said, has anybody ever tried to assassinate you? That's not your question, is it?
No.
Okay.
We've talked a lot about threats to democracy at home, and I think I'm curious, looking ahead at some of the democracies that are under direct threat abroad, like a Taiwan, for example. I guess my question is, do you view Taiwan as an imminent threat to democracy, an independent democracy that's being annexed potentially by China? And how can we as Americans ameliorate that problem, reduce that threat?
I think the former Secretary of Defense should answer that.
I'm not sure I understand your question.
Do you view Taiwan being a Pacific conflict and being annexed as an imminent threat to democracy?
Is
that going to
China's
happen?
a threat to Taiwan imminent? How near term?
Well, when you say imminent, you mean the next year or
during the next administration?
No, I mean the Chinese have said that they intend by the end of this decade to reunite with Taiwan. I mean, they've clearly said that as a foreign policy statement. She has said it. When I was Secretary of Defense, actually before I was Secretary of Defense, when he was Vice President, I met with him 3 times in 2014 on a trip to Asia. It was a specific trip to meet with him over the East China Sea, South China Sea, and what they were doing, building up those little rock islands. So that he lied, of course, and said, no, these are commercial areas, so we can help trade, international trade, because so much trade goes up and down the East China Sea. And that was a lie. I mean, I showed him the satellite photos, which he did not appreciate. But what they were building up were landing zones, submarine bases, and so on, and actually to inflict control over the East China Sea. Anyway, the point being, 3 different meetings I had with him, and we talked about Taiwan very specifically on one of those meetings. And he informed me very clearly and specifically and directly that Taiwan belongs to China, the People's Republic of China, and that unification would take place one way or the other. And he said it'll be by the end of this decade. I mean, he said that, but I heard that from him directly. So we're going to be dealing with that one of these days, and that takes us back to part of the questions we had about how the United States is dealing with assistance to Taiwan, and what's the lesson the Chinese are going to learn from Ukraine. And are we going to continue to help Ukraine and make sure Putin's not successful? And because all these things have consequences, very clear consequences.
Well, we could keep going, but we can't keep going. And I just want to say we're going to thank you properly in just a moment with some applause. But what I want to do is I just want to say it could not have been better, especially the 2 of you, and giving us that inside look of what it must have been like to have been serving together and how cooperative and so forth. That's really just tremendous. But what I'd like to do, Kevin, can you help me? I'd like to give a couple of things. And the very first thing here I'd like to do and I'm going to save this for just a second, so just 1 second, is Secretary Johnson, we like to give our Hagel speakers a little memento, a little thanks.
Thank you.
And we just want to say, and you've been just spectacular. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And then we certainly learned that your grandfather, very special to you. So you've talked about him many times here, and almost every time we've spoken, you've talked about him with great respect. So Kyle Larson, who works at our CPOST Center, he's a full-time PhD researcher. He did some research on your grandfather.
Wow. Okay.
We have a special collections here in Rubenstein Library. And so we went and we wanted to get some of the information from some of the professors that had your grandfather and from the boxes. And so we also have your grandfather's transcripts.
Oh, okay.
Very impressive, I want to tell you.
Okay, all right.
Just as now we would
transcript.
expect.
I can't wait to look at it. Okay.
Well, see, we didn't also know what you had, so we didn't want the graduation booklet, page from the cap and gown, an obituary for Dr. Park.
Robert Park.
Yes, by
It was his mentor.
his mentor. So this is very special, and you'll see this has some very interesting anecdotes you may or may not be aware of. A wonderful article in the Encyclopedia, International Encyclopedia for the Social Science that we found here. And again, these are from the professors, you see what I mean? So they're keeping it about your grandfather. And then a review about your grandfather's famous work, The Negro in Chicago. And so we very much hope you will appreciate that and enjoy and learn. And that just is what we do at CPOST is research.
Oh, here's the transcript. Okay.
There's the transcript.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I just want to say a big thank you to all of you, and if you could just all join me in giving both of our gentlemen.
Oh, thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Jay. Thank you.